Can you share a practical example where you helped a team move from strategic intent to successful execution? Jim?
Absolutely. And this was, I started to answer this question with the previous question, but then I figured I'd pause on that. But so when I was working with a fintech company, and we had some pretty big expectations. We had just partnered with one of the largest providers in small business financial information, and we went from having this pool of hundreds of thousands of customers that we had been targeting to now millions of customers, right? By partnering with this third party. And so there were big expectations there. And so in order to achieve some of the goals that we had, we really focused on OKRs. OKRs was the framework that we used to help drive our goals and to really keep us on track. And so what that allowed us to do is it allowed us to create, kind of going back to shared goals, it allowed us to create shared goals with our partner. And so, that third party partner relationship that we had was just tremendous. So from a OKR perspective, we knew what our goals were, not only our goals as a company, right, but our partners' goals. What did that look like? Because we spent some time collaborating and having these discussions. To build out these OKRs, we actually spent a week together working with our partner. And so we really focused on what it was that we were trying to achieve. We focused on what our constraints were, right? We focused on, what tools did we have at our disposal, and how could we achieve these goals? And by doing so, we were collaborating across multiple teams, right? Again, sales, marketing, engineering. And one of the things that we found was that we had some engineering constraints. And with that, it really kind of, limited some of the goals that we were trying to achieve. But by understanding that and knowing that that was a limitation, what it allowed us to do was really to focus on what could we do from a marketing and sales perspective, right? And this was my first exposure to working with a good marketing team. Prior to working with this team, I really knew nothing about marketing, really didn't know much what they did, but the opportunity to work with this team was just amazing. And by honing in on what it was that we were trying to achieve, knowing what our goal was, how we were measuring against that goal, really allowed us to focusing on what could we achieve, again, from a marketing and sales perspective. And long story short, we drove some really impressive numbers. We've had 153% increase in subscription revenue for one of our lines of business. And then we also drove 108% revenue over year, right? And so, again, OKRs really allowed us to focus on what it is that we were trying to achieve. It helped us understand where our resource constraints were, and it helped us understand how we were going to hold ourselves accountable and how we measure what success looked like, right? And so in terms of, being able to deliver on that, when you're laser focused like that, it's a lot different than working on a project where requirements are vague, right? Kind of going back to what Chris was talking about in the first question, just about a clearly defined goal, right? Do we even know what a clearly defined goal was? And so by spending time as a group at an offsite, we were laser focused on what our goals were. And so, that's the power of OKRs when you're really focusing on what it is that you're trying to achieve. So,
absolutely.
All right. Well, I'm going to use that public-private partnership that I mentioned earlier as my example. So I came in to become executive director of a municipal level chamber of commerce in mid-2008. And if we remember what happened in 2008, that was the Great Recession year. So a lot of places were having really bad impacts to their economy. Local, state, federal, everything was kind of tanking. And so I picked a really good time to come take over an organization that was having issues with, they were losing members, so they were shrinking. As a result, it's a nonprofit, so their revenue was dropping. They couldn't afford their staff. They couldn't afford to really provide any resources to their members. So obviously, when you're not getting your money's worth, you're going to start walking. And so I had to come in and fix all this, not knowing about this when they hired me. They didn't tell me this until I showed up and I saw that the big gaping smoldering hole in the budget and everything else. And so what I ended up having to do was you have to take an assessment of the situation. I interviewed members that remained, members that left. So I was out and about talking to a lot of different folks. As I mentioned, I also had two different boards of directors, if you will. I had the city council who had their objectives because they decided to come in and help, which was how they funded my salary. Half of it came from the chamber, half of it came from the city. And so I was supposed to help the city with economic development simultaneous to being a director of the chamber. Long story short, I found there was a lot of dynamics, and the reason why the budget was not doing so well is too many people had access to the money. Not just the treasurer and some of the executives. And so as a result, there was a lot of checks and balances that had to be put into the money. Also, we had to get a steady source of revenue. They expected me coming from the U.S. Senate to just write a bunch of grant requests and everyone was going to survive on grants, which is no way to run a nonprofit or any other business for that matter. So I said, we're not doing that. So I ended up restructuring the entire place. I redid the bylaws. I had to teach the board how to do an orderly board meeting. A lot of these were just small town folks who just had a business. And then once we restructured the place, I ended up putting some stock into where the members had more of a stake in the success of the organization. So we created committees. It wasn't just the board directing to all the members what they were going to do. It was sort of a co-chaired approach where a board member was a co-chair of a committee, finance, whatever it was, external relations, government affairs, whatever. And then there would be a member, an up-and-coming member that might be being groomed to become a future board member that would be a person in charge of that. And then people who volunteered would get chosen based on their skill sets and merits, things of that sort. And that way, we were able to get people to get excited again. I also had to take responsibility as sort of the public face, and I had to give a briefing to everybody in the city and everybody in the business community and say, hey, we're taking this serious now. We plan on growing. We need your help, and we want you to grow despite the economic situation we're in. So I ended up working a lot of deals to get very cheap but very impactful resources and educational tools to help them understand basics of economics. And as a result, we expanded our economic reach as a small town to include some global overseas trade opportunities for even some of the tiniest small businesses. We ended up growing in funds and members, and our economy was one of the few in our state at the time that I lived in that was basically doing pretty well. We did have a few businesses closed, but for every business we had closed, we had 2 new ones popping in. And so a lot of that was due to more of a conservative approach. We did take some calculated risks, but I made sure that everybody understood that the document was short, it was to the point, it was clear, and if people didn't understand it, when we coordinated it, I wanted everybody in the membership to tell me that it didn't make sense so that everybody was in agreement. So we had the buy-in that Jim talked about, we had the structure that we needed that had just enough authority figure in the decision cycle, and enough ownership of the membership to make them feel like they were part of the team. And as a result, we saw some success in execution to the point where we had other small towns and even some bigger cities wanting to work with us regionally in partnerships, as well as giving them some of the tool sets that we found successful. So a little bit of strategic thinking goes a long way. And just getting people to understand what that means, because a lot of them thought they knew what it meant, but clearly they didn't. And so this was one way that I helped get them back on track.
I think you nail it there, Chris, right? In terms of just speaking a common language, understanding how do you interpret this definition versus how I interpret this definition? There's just that disconnect there. I was in a meeting one time where we had the head of sales and the head of marketing, and we were looking at this metric. They were both getting the metric from 2 different places, right? And so just having that conversation alone, being aligned on definitions and even data sources, can make a huge difference in terms of what is it that we're trying to achieve,
Yeah, well, the other thing about a team is I had to help this group become a team, because there were a lot of people that were there for the status symbol of being on a board member of the local chamber of commerce. And if those of you haven't worked or had a business in a small town, sometimes you may not have had to deal with that situation, but it happens in government too, where people think that I'm in charge, I'm on the committee, or I'm the chair, or whatever. And as a result, they think they can do whatever they want without any checks or balances on their personality or their egos or any of that stuff. So you had to get people to understand that it's not about you, it's about the organization. It's about achieving the organizational goals, not your own personal goals. There may be some overlap, but that's not the organization's responsibility.
Well, and that's key, understanding roles and responsibilities. That's one of the areas where I think a lot of companies struggle when it comes to strategy and execution, right? Is because we're unclear of our roles and our responsibility. And if nobody's responsible for it, then nobody's responsible for it, right? And I think that's, one of the things with frameworks like OKRs is that it does establish those roles and responsibilities, because at the heart of it, it's change management that we're talking about here with objectives and key results, right? We're implementing this process, and we're implementing this new way of working because there's this goal that we need to be laser focused on. And with this new process, with this new framework, comes a different way of working, right? A different way of new definitions, new clarity around what it is that we're trying to achieve, but also understanding how roles and responsibilities play into this new framework, right? How does my role change? And I'm going to be reporting on what now, and which tool am I using, and and where do I get my data and so forth, right? There's a lot of change to that. And so I think that's where a lot of companies struggle, because that's that operationalizing it into your cadence, right? And so, yeah, no, that's interesting.
That and you have to track whether or not you're meeting your task and your objectives on the way to the end state that you're trying to achieve. A lot of places just say, here's our strategy, and then they just put it on the shelf